Welcome to IVF This, episode 156, IVF and Arguing with Reality. Welcome to IVF This. I'm your host, Emily Ginn. After 10 years of primary and secondary infertility due to both male and female factor infertility, I am now the mother to 3 beautiful miracles. I am married to my favorite person in the world. I'm a social worker, a life coach, and an IVF warrior. I'm here to teach you how to manage your mind and emotions during your IVF journey, to break free from anxiety and regain control of your life, even in the midst of infertility. I'm going to teach you how to say IVF this to how we think about, talk about, and experience infertility. Let's go. Hello, my beautiful friends. I hope you're all doing so well today. Today, we're going to talk about a universal experience for all humans, IVFers and not, and that is the concept of arguing with reality. First, I want to remind everyone that I am accepting new clients. So if you're listening to this and you're wanting to know what it's like to work with me, just have a coaching session, experience anything, ask questions, whatever, now is absolutely the time for you to do that. So I tend to slow down a little bit during the summer months, but right now I have 4 slots that are available, and that would carry us through the entire summer because I work with people in like 13-week blocks. So if you're interested in working together, you can schedule what I call the Take Back Your Life call, which is completely complimentary. And we can meet, you can get some coaching, we can learn what it would be like to work together. So it's a wonderful call, again, completely complimentary, and there's no requirement to sign up, right? If we get to the end of the call and you're like, thank you, but I'm good, or thank you, but I'm going to go in a different direction, all the love in the world, that's totally fine. I just always want you to get what you come for, but it is available to you no matter what. So you can go about it scheduling one of 2 ways. You can go to my actual website, which is www.ivfthiscoaching.com /work with me. Or you can go to either my Facebook or my Instagram profiles, and there is a link in my bio for that. So let us get talking to the topic of the day. So I have a client who said, she was telling me a story about working with a previous therapist, and the therapist told her, you have an argumentative relationship with reality. And it really got me thinking that I talk and have talked a lot about arguing with reality on this podcast, but I don't think I've ever dedicated an entire episode. I know I have never dedicated an entire episode, but I don't really know that I've talked in depth about arguing with reality, except to say arguing with reality, right? So that's what I wanted to do today. I want to set the scene for what arguing with reality is, like who developed the concept, what it looks like in terms of IVF or infertility, why we do it, because I think providing ourselves context for what is happening and why is so important while we're kind of healing and better understanding ourselves. And then one thing, I'm just going to give you one thing to focus on so that you can start having a less argumentative relationship with reality. Okay, let's go. So the phrase arguing with reality is commonly associated with Byron Katie. She's a well-known author, speaker, and developed a self-inquiry model known as the work. If you're interested to learn what that can be about, let me know. I can do a full podcast episode on Byron Katie. I absolutely love her work. Also, her book, Loving What Is. It's a fantastic book. I will be honest, it's a dense read, so don't think you're going to breeze right through it. It's one of those things that you want to take a little bit at a time and kind of absorb what she's saying. But it is a fantastic book. It gives a lot of vignettes around her using the work, which is 4 questions and some other things. She does some vignettes with her working with actual people, so you get to hear, right, without the luxury of video and getting to watch the back and forth. You're actually getting to read, Katie said this person said this, right? The back and forth of what that looks like. And I think that's really impactful for understanding what her approach is and understanding what the quote unquote the work is, right? So Byron Katie talks about this and emphasizing the importance of accepting reality as it is, and actually suggests that resisting or arguing with reality is one of the primary sources of our suffering as humans. She often talks about this phrase to illustrate the futility and pain of trying to change or deny what is true, right? So her work encourages people to kind of question their thoughts and beliefs, similar to my work, and ultimately leading us to a place of peace and acceptance, which I think kind of collectively we could all agree that that's like the ideal place we would want to be, is a place of peace, right? So Byron Katie frequently says, when you argue with reality, you lose, but only 100% of the time. And I've said that on the podcast and I've credited her as well. And as it is largely true, at least in my experience of it and what I've witnessed with my clients, right? Again, the idea is to highlight this belief that resisting what is happening will only lead to continued suffering. Okay. So when I tell you that this is a universal experience for every human, I want you to believe me. Even the most mindful, the most grounded, and the least attached person at some point in their life will have argued with reality. Something will happen or not happen, and you will argue with reality about it, right? It's as guaranteed as death. I didn't mean for that to go as morbid as it went, but I think you guys get the point. Now, I don't think that many of us, even coaches and therapists who are really well versed in this concept, ever really say to ourselves when something happens or something doesn't happen, I am going to argue with reality right now, or I am arguing with reality right now. This idea of arguing with reality is much more like insidious. It's much more sneaky than that. And it can look like, and please remember that this is not an exhaustive list. This is just what I tend to see most often. It can look like this. So, number one, a denial of infertility. Some of us not, and this is never a good, bad, right, or wrong, but some of us deny that this is actually happening, that infertility could be our diagnosis. Or we're continuously hoping for a natural conception, maybe even despite medical evidence suggesting otherwise. Now, there are some of us, myself included, that kind of feel a disturbance in the force, right? We kind of feel that there is something underlying, or that there's a reason we're not getting pregnant. Like that was absolutely sure for me. Like after a couple of months of trying, I really felt this pit in my stomach that something was wrong. Others of us, and this isn't an enlightenment hierarchy or anything like that, don't think that there is anything wrong, or we're very, very scared to talk to a doctor for various reasons, right? Maybe one of them is they're worried about the cost, or they feel like no matter what, it's not going to work. And so they don't want to confront that, right? So in essence, you're kind of denying it. Okay. Another one is unrealistic expectations. I am the queen of unrealistic expectations, right? So one of these examples would be expecting immediate success with IVF, or not really accepting or believing that it could take multiple cycles, or that there is a potential for failure. You got to remember that the national average, at least within the United States, for IVF to result in a live birth is 3 to 4 cycles. Please remember this number has a lot of nuance to it, right? So I don't want that to freak you out or to dishearten you. There are many individual medical and other factors that influence that success rate, as well as factoring in like the cumulative success rate of IVF. But I know for certain, I thought we will be one and done. When we first started going through IVF, I think I was 32 or 33. So I was like, bag, this is in the bag, right? I've got this. And in a lot of ways, we did experience that, right? We did one stimulation cycle. We got 2 embryos. The first embryo stuck. That is now my 6-year-old child. But when the second one didn't work, and I had all of that expectation kind of built upon itself, like, well, of course, this one's going to work. The last one worked. It absolutely devastated me because of the unrealistic expectation that because it worked in the past, it was going to work, right? And so when that happened, when my expectation didn't align with reality, you bet your tail that there was a fair share of arguing with reality, right? This didn't happen. How could it have happened? I don't understand why it happened. All of those are phrases that are tied to arguing with reality. Another one could be blaming yourself or your partner, insisting that infertility must be due to a personal fault or or your partner's fault. There's a lot of medical information that we have now. A third of infertility is related to male factor, a third is related to female factor, and a third is like the bucket of yuck that's unknown infertility. They can't actually pinpoint an attributable cause, right? But sometimes, certainly in my case, I blamed my husband. Not for any specific reason, because there was medical evidence to support both he and I, both male and female factor infertility. But I had to go somewhere with my anger, with my grief. And after I had done a fairly thorough job of beating the crap out of myself, I turned my anger towards him. Not that it was a good decision or fair or right or anything like that, but that was what I did in that moment. Okay? And that leads us again towards another aspect, which is resenting other people, right? Feeling anger or resentment towards others who have maybe conceived easily or have children, and focusing on the unfairness of that situation. This leads to social isolation and increased pain. We are wired for connection. So the more that we socially isolate because of these things, even though it makes sense why we isolate, that compounds the pain that we experience because we're not able to find connection with one another. This is one of the hardest things for us to manage, because when we do this, we tend to also have narratives around like being horrible friends or horrible daughters or sisters or whatever that is, right? That adds an additional layer of shame and guilt, which, I mean, then it's just like a parfait of terrible, right? We're just feeling terrible upon terrible upon terrible. Another one is over focusing on outcomes. And this is really tough because everything that we're going through, especially during IVF, is very binary, right? It either works or it doesn't. You either respond to the meds or you don't. You either have eggs or you don't. They're either mature or they're not. They'll either fertilize or they don't, right? They'll mature to blast or they won't. You will get pregnant or you won't, right? Everything is so binary and so outcome driven that it is really hard to see how being over focused on outcomes actually is a form of arguing with reality, right? It's completely understandable, but we tend to focus on the things that are the least within our control. So when we spend so much mental and emotional energy on trying to focus on the outcome, we then tend to feel more out of control. And that is one of the most painful aspects. And it is an argument with reality. The reality of the situation is we don't get to control the outcome. We get to control how we think, how we feel, and what we do, right? We're taking the medications, we're going to the doctor's appointments, we're taking the supplements, maybe going to acupuncture, seeing a therapist or seeing a coach, right? We have control of all of that, but we do not ultimately have control over whether or not it works, which is the one thing, for God's sake, that we want control over, right? So it makes sense why we veer towards that, but ultimately it is an aspect of arguing with reality. And the last one that I tend to see the most often is ignoring your own emotional needs, neglecting the emotional and psychological toll. And when I say toll, I mean I am heavy on the toll that infertility and IVF takes. Sometimes we will not even seek counseling or support or coaching or anything like that, right? Some of us may believe that we should be able to handle it alone. That was absolutely me at the beginning of my journey. No one will understand, or that getting pregnant is the only thing that matters, leads us unprotected from the emotional toll of this process and what the experience takes on us. And I'm a big, or at least I've been historically a big perpetrator of this, right? This ignoring of my emotional state, right? Just kind of sweep it under the rug, push it down, whatever that is. I've done that many times in my past, right? I tend to just kind of barrel through whatever the challenge is ahead of me. And it doesn't work with IVF and infertility because the inputs don't equal the outcome all the time, right? And so it's one of the main reasons that I think we often feel like we've lost a part of ourselves during this process. Now, like I said, these are just a few of the common ones that I see. So now that we have an idea of what it looks like, I want you to understand why we argue with reality. For me, and I do this a lot in the podcast, but I do it honestly for me because I think that understanding something by giving myself context for what I'm doing and why, it helps to lessen the emotional labor that all of this takes on you. It actually can lessen the hold that argument with reality, that tension holds over us, right? Now, I want to pause and mention that we do not do these things consciously, or at least most of these things, right? Pretty much all of this is happening in the unconscious part of our brain. The parts that were originally designed to have us evolve to keep us safe and pain free. Okay. The idea is called the motivational triad. Did a podcast episode a couple of years ago. I think if you search IVF and the emotional triad, you should be able to find the episode. But the idea is that our brain has evolved to focus on three things: seek pleasure, avoid pain, and to be as efficient as possible. So I always want to reiterate, we do not talk about these things to shame ourselves or to judge ourselves. We do it to understand and to decide with intention what we want to do and how we want to show up. This is a judgment-free, a bully-free zone, my friends, okay? So just like the ways it can show up for us, there are many reasons why we argue with reality when we are experiencing or going through an IVF or infertility journey. Really any challenge in our life, but of course we want to keep it specific to IVF. So as I talk about it, you're going to see some parallels between how that can look, right? What that can look like and why we do it, right? So the first one is our desire for control. Whew, there are a lot of aspects of infertility and IVF that feels like they are completely outside of our control. And some of them are, right? The outcomes that I talked about, really outside of our control. So when we think about accepting, quote unquote, accepting our reality, that often means that we have to confront our uncertainty or our lack of control. If you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, you've heard me say that the most dangerous feeling for us is uncertainty. The most dangerous thing in our brains is uncertainty. So, in a way, arguing with reality like this isn't happening or this can't be happening almost gives you an illusion of control, right? Now, it doesn't make us feel better. It just makes it feel like we have some control, right? Because we're thinking like, oh, this can't happen. I can't believe this is happening. What do I need to do differently? Like we start to like put some of the puzzle pieces together as best we can. And that feels productive, which in essence gives us that illusion of control. Fear is a big driver for our desire to control, right? So the fear of the unknown or of uncertain outcomes tends to lead to that resistance, to that arguing with reality, because it's very fear and uncertainty based. Okay. The next one is our attachment to expectations. You heard me talk about unrealistic expectations, hyper focusing on outcomes. All of us create expectations for how we think things should go or how we want things to go. So when our reality doesn't match up to that desired expectation, or we get an undesirable outcome, it's like our brain cannot compute it, right? It cannot comprehend that our reality does not match what we expected to have happen. So because there is a discrepancy, right? That cognitive dissonance, holding two contradictory beliefs at the same time, we resist it. It's natural, it's normal, okay? Another one is the experience of emotional pain, right? Denial is a defense mechanism. Good, bad, useful, not, doesn't really matter. It is an effective coping mechanism. Acknowledging a painful situation or reality is very overwhelming. And we might not be ready to process that overwhelm, to experience that overwhelm. So in turn, we deny it until we are either willing or ready to process it. The next one is social and cultural influences. Social media plays a huge role for us when we are deep within like the infertility, IVF, pregnancy, online communities. It plays a role for all of us, right? Social media in general, because social media is like a bombardment of social and cultural influences, whether they are helpful or not, right? There's a lot of comparison that we make. And then with the toxic positivity that we encounter via social media or the people in our lives, even, it can make us feel like we aren't living up to other people's expectations when we don't share the same level of toxic positivity, or maybe we're not feeling hopeful or excited. We also tend to carry the weight of other people's feelings and other people's reactions, right? We don't want to make people feel uncomfortable. We don't want people to be sad. All of that carries a massive weight for us. It is a lot of emotional labor that we go through. So, because our brain, right, the motivational triad, does not want to feel pain, that is painful. It is going to resist it. Okay. The overall emotional investment. IVF is a massive physical, emotional, mental, social, and financial investment. No two ways about it. Because of how large the investment is, we will tend to tie our beliefs around self-worth, identity, um, the things that we feel about ourselves and our lives. We tend to tie that and the expectations we have with the outcome. This makes it even more challenging when we have outcomes that we don't want or situations that challenge those identities and beliefs. There's really few things in this world that are more painful than a challenge to your identity, okay? Which is why infertility and shame are so intertwined, because our identity of being quote unquote women and what our bodies were designed to do, that's a massive, massive challenge to our identity as women, which is why it's so painful. Which is, again, if it's painful, chances are we're going to try to argue with reality. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about trauma and past experiences. Past traumas related to infertility or not shape how we perceive and respond to our current experiences, our expectations, outcomes, everything. People who have experienced trauma tend to have a heightened need for control and predictability, and sometimes can be very inflexible about that need, understandably so. Because of that inflexibility, right, that very black and white binary thinking, it makes it really difficult to kind of stop arguing with reality, but also work towards acceptance. So, what's the answer? Well, it's difficult. I think since most people will argue with reality at some point in their lives, we want to accept that we will, in fact, argue with reality at some point in our lives, right? Again, my desire today was help you to better understand what it is and why we do it. But I think if you're going to work on one thing, and this is really the only thing I want you to focus on, one thing is that two things or more can be true at the same time. I want to get X number of healthy embryos out of the cycle, and I know that I can't control that, right? I can't control that happening. I can't control that outcome. I'm excited for my upcoming transfer, and I know that nothing is guaranteed. And I will also do everything within my power to prepare myself for this. I feel anger, resentment, sadness, frustration, restlessness, what, right? Insert your uncomfortable emotion. And I know it is temporary and it will pass. I'm thinking some really hard things about myself right now, some really sad, scary, anger provoking things right now. And I know it's not necessarily true. I am sad and grieving, and I know I can't change what has happened. When we're able to see that two things or more can be true at the same time, we're able or better positioned to get to a place of acceptance. When we can acknowledge multiple truths, we don't then have to overcome the hurdle of arguing with reality. That part, right? Because arguing with reality is by its very nature black and white thinking. When you can accept multiple truths, you're bypassing that part of arguing with reality, right? There's going to be an element of it, right? I'm not saying that you should go directly from receiving really hard news to just peaceful acceptance. I don't know that that's a realistic expectation for most, if not all people. But you don't have to stay in that place of arguing with reality for as long as when you're able to accept multiple truths, right? To wrap this up, I want to talk a little bit about acceptance. I dedicated an entire episode. I think it was called Acceptance Isn't What You Think It Is. And I did that a while ago. But I think still, within our cultural lexicon, our cultural and social beliefs around what acceptance is, I think most people still equate acceptance to either giving up or that acceptance means that you have to feel good about the thing that's happening or has happened. And I don't believe that to be true. You don't have to like something for you to acknowledge that it is happening or has happened. You can want something to be different and understand that it won't be, right? See those two truths at the same time? No amount of anger or worry is going to change what has happened. And that's a powerful realization. But it's important to realize the true meaning of this statement and not take it the wrong way. Because acceptance shouldn't be confused with passivity, right? It's not that we must not do nothing. It's about being ready and willing to do what comes naturally in your circumstances. And I'm kind of, as I'm wrapping up, as I was writing this, I should say, I was very deep in my feelings about all of you, right? It's very often that I kind of think about the IVFers, the ones that I've worked with, the ones that I will never work with, the ones that I may work with, right? Just whomever might be listening to this podcast. I think about you guys every day. And so I want you to be proud of yourselves for what you're experiencing. We're all messy. It's going to be messy. We're people and humans. We're messy. Emotions are messy. It's okay to be messy. But don't for 1 second doubt your capabilities to take care of yourself, to weather this storm, to be a strong, kind, empathetic, and compassionate human. There's so many things that we cannot change, but we will always have control over what we think, how we feel, and what we do. And as I was writing this, there were two quotes that came to me, two of some of my favorite quotes in the world. So I want to share them with you. The first one requires a little bit of background, so bear with me. But Randy Pausch, who was a college professor in the early 2000s, was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And he wrote and gave this beautiful lecture called The Last Lecture. You can still find it on YouTube. And he also co-wrote a book of the same name. He passed away, I think, before 2010, maybe 2008, 2009, something like that. But it really is a beautiful and powerful book. And one of his quotes that he used in both The Last Lecture, the actual talk that he gave, as well as in the book, was, "We cannot change the cards we are dealt, just how we play the hand." And in a similar vein, this actually comes from Lord of the Rings. I've seen it a few times. It's from the Fellowship of the Ring. It was a conversation between Frodo and Gandalf, where Frodo says, "I wish it need not have happened in my time." And Gandalf replies, "So do I, and so do all who live to see such times. But it is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us." You don't get to decide how successful IVF is or not. There's too many variables that are within this process that you don't get control over. But you do get to decide how you show up. in your life, with your people, in your own head, and in your own body. Those things matter because you matter. It's okay to experience all the feelings and have all of the thoughts, but make sure you are still protecting and caring for you. Acceptance isn't like the opposite of arguing with reality. Acceptance is not resignation. It is not passively giving up. It takes courage and strength. Courage and strength that is already inside of you, that you already exhibit daily, just by nature of going through this experience, experiencing this journey. And I will continue to show up to remind you of that. And that is what I have for you today, my friends. I hope you have a beautiful day, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard, click subscribe and follow to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you want to learn more, head over to www.ivfthiscoaching.com to learn how to work together.